But this progress has come at a cost. It has come at a cost to the environment. We burn wood and fossil fuels for energy. We've expanded farmlands at the cost of forests. And our insatiable appetite for meat means we now use half of the world's habitable land for farming. We kill billions of animals every year. These are the trends that make us feel doomed. We see these lines rising and we assume that they might never stop. But more recent data tells us a slightly different story, a more hopeful story that we can turn things around. This is per capita CO2 emissions in the UK since 1750. Now, over the last few decades, emissions in the UK have halved. That means that my carbon footprint today is less than half that of my grandparents when they were my age. And that's despite the fact I live a much more extravagant lifestyle, or as they'd put it, you youngsters just don't know how good you've got it these days. Now, you might think the UK's cheating here. It used to be this industrial powerhouse. Now it just gets China, India, Bangladesh to produce its stuff for it. Maybe it's just offshored all of these emissions. If there's a bit of truth to this, when we adjust for trade, emissions in the UK are higher. But we still see this dramatic decline over the last few decades. Offshoring is a bit of the story, but it's not the entire story. At the same time, the UK has increased its GDP. GDP has gone up while emissions have come down. And it's not the only country to achieve this. You will see the same for the US, for Germany, France, Spain, Portugal. A long list of countries have increased GDP while reducing their emissions. And again, this is not just because they've offshored them. The notion that economic growth has to be incompatible with reducing our environmental impact is simply wrong. Now, rich countries are reducing their emissions, but low and middle income countries are increasing theirs. What does this mean at a global level? Well, total CO2 emissions are now beginning to flatline, but actually emissions per person already peaked a decade ago. That means the emissions of the average person in the world today have peaked and are now falling, and we will see a peak in total CO2 emissions soon. Now, why is this happening? A big driver has been technological change. Here we see coal production in the UK since 1700. Now, the UK was the birthplace of industrial coal, and it has now died there. When I was born, more than half of the UK's electricity was coming from coal. This is now less than 2%. And it's dying in many other countries too. Here we see the same for US, Germany, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Ireland. In many countries in the world, coal is dying. Taking its place are renewables, where costs are plummeting. The cost of solar has fallen by 99.8% since 1970. It's fallen by 90% in the last decade alone. And if you're worried that it looks like this price trend is levelling off, don't be. When we zoom in, we see that the price of solar continues to fall. Now, the same is true for wind. Go back a decade, and solar and wind were among the most expensive energy technologies we had. That is why the world was not making progress. That is why countries were not deploying them. They were far too expensive. But just 10 years on, and that script has flipped. In many countries in the world, solar and wind are now the cheapest. Now, if we're going to have renewables, we're going to need energy storage. But there's good news there too. The price of batteries has fallen by 98% since 1990. If you take the battery you'd find in a Tesla today, go back to 1990, it would have cost $1 million. It now costs just $12,000. That's completely transformed the world of energy storage and completely transformed the world of transport. Global sales of petrol and diesel cars have already peaked. They peaked in 2017 and they are now falling. Taking their place are electric cars, where in the space of just a few years, sales are going through the roof.